Hello everybody, my name is Maggie. I'm here to talk to you about data curation for the social scientists. So first I'd like to start with just defining what data curation is. So the University of Illinois defines data curation as the active and ongoing management of data throughout its life cycle. Throwing in the definition here of preservation because it's one aspect of data curation that aims to ensure long-term access of data. So when we talk about social scientists and we talk about preserving and curating your data for the long term, preservation is going to fall into that, and we'll talk about it later on. But since much of the research performed by you guys is typically observational, survey, or interview-based, this presentation is going to focus on qualitative data curation specifically. So we're going to talk about why data curation is important. So as social scientists, investigating, collecting information, and analyzing that behavior is often your primary focus. However, the question of what next usually doesn't get addressed. So your focus should also include that long-term management and secondary use of your research data. So not just analyzing that information, but what to do with that information after you're done with it. We're going to watch this quick video here just about the importance of data curation.
I think the other thing to emphasize on data management is that it's time consuming. I think oftentimes we think of data analysis as a rather quick process. You have your hypothesis, you go to the data, you test it out, you refine it, and you come away with your results. And it's never, ever like that. Hypotheses evolve in more of a kind of iterative relationship with the data. In the course of that iterative relationship, the shape of the actual data changes. And unless you've got a good record of how it's changed and why it's changed, if at any point in the future you go back to that data, it's very easy to find that you're lost.
So again, that just is talking about the importance of planning for that long term and how it can affect your data and actually how it can in the future reflect upon the results of your study as well. So as it relates to social scientists, let's talk about those possible reuses of your information. So why would you even think about storing your data set after you're done with it? Well, it could be used to compare with other data sources over time between social groups or regions. So somebody else may want to reference your data set. A reanalysis. So you might think of new questions to ask from that data set. And had you gotten rid of it, you wouldn't be able to go back, or had you not preserved it properly, you would not be able to go back and use that same information. You'd have to repeat that study. Also, research design could be a potential use of a reuse of your information. So people designing a new study with a developing methodology. So as information and things change, somebody could repurpose that data set of yours. For description, so as the future goes on, and historians will someday take a look back on our time, they'll be able to use your data to analyze maybe different societies, groups of organizations, attributes. You're not really sure what somebody in the future could have a use for your data. So that's why preserving it and curating it properly should be a primary focus, like we talked about in the last slide. And lastly, it could be used for teaching and learning, so just providing unique materials for students. So what you need to consider as a social scientist, and I'm just going to iterate this one more time, that you need to think beyond the analysis stage. So if we start thinking of research as your research, as a special collection, this could help. So as you go into the library or the archive and you start looking for information on a certain topic or records, what do you need in order to find that information? So that's where you need to start thinking how you can apply I guess metadata or standards to your data set in order for people in the future to be able to find it like you do in with your special collections today. So how are you preparing to have that data ready for the long term? And have you documented your work so that it can be validated and traced back to its source? So this is a very important concept. And I found this funny graph here to help demonstrate this. But here we've got a graph, don't really know what it is, and the description here says it's a map or a model or a design or something of something rendered by someone or somebody, yada, yada, yada. So you can see here that somebody didn't think long term with their data and how to preserve it so that people could go back, they could validate that information, and they could use it possibly again in the future. And this is kind of just a joke graph, but it does emphasize a problem that runs rampant in data curation, this idea of not being able to trace back to the original source. So we're going to talk about a few phases of data curation as it relates to social sciences. And the first one is going to be here planning. And this stage includes possibly writing funding bids and also writing a data management plan. I'm going to get into a lot more detail of that in a second. But the impact that planning can have is on the subsequent efforts to curate and preserve the research can be substantial. So documenting, and I'm going to mention this a couple times throughout the presentation, but documenting and explaining what you do, so the sources of, the rationale behind, your selection of theories, your methods, and your measures is super imperative. So doing this helps later users of that data help understand the parameters of what you were doing and to better help them plan their analysis or their use, right? Their reuse of your data like we had talked about on the previous slide. So it also helps to avoid some serious problems of having to redo research from scratch. So the world's not perfect. Sometimes computers die, servers, get killed, data gets lost, or even just programs change and that data can no longer be accessible. So by documenting everything that you did in the past and coming up with this data management plan can help to avoid some of these implications in the future. We're going to talk about that here a little bit more. So when we talk about a data management plan, why is it important? You don't necessarily need one. However, if you're looking for funding, well, then you're going to want one. So a few years ago, the NSF required that all grants include a data management plan. So here are a couple elements that the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Science Directorate said were helpful to include within your data management plan. So takeaway from this is that if you want funding to support your qualitative research, you need to first write that data management plan. And to be quite honest, data curation is much more difficult without a data management plan, without a plan of how you're going to execute. And the next phase here is creating. So this stage includes collecting and creating data, software considerations, and maybe some ethics and legal requirements of the data collection. So again, providing that detailed explanation is very important. We recommend to automate wherever possible. So because qualitative data has more room for error, let's say, because it may be text-based, there may be less controlled vocabularies, there's just more opportunity for things to be misclassed or mistyped. Adding automation or quality checks is recommended in this stage. So, and like I had just mentioned, all those issues with qualitative data, I think they can lead to typing errors, codes that don't make sense, records that don't match, and that list goes on and on. Again, that's just that iteration of full documentation. Where this is important here, though, is to note that online tools that you may use today may not be in existence tomorrow. So keep that in consideration throughout your collection process. So if you're using a proprietary software, that may be including screenshots of what the the tool looked like, providing as much information to the point where you think it could be redundant is actually very, very helpful for future researchers. Also, there could be some ethical implications with your data set and making it publicly available. And considering that beforehand can actually affect the way you collect your information, how you collect it, and what is collected. So prior to submitting any qualitative data, social scientists should really take care to remove any information that can allow any of their research subjects to be identified. And this is very important for your field. So the next phase here is organizing. This stage includes naming conventions and metadata. So many repositories, so the end place for your data collection or the potential end place for your data collection, they already have format and metadata standards in place. And they do this in order to improve that reuse and discoverability of your data collection for the future. So when you're creating this information, folder and file naming conventions are absolute. They're needed. So this makes the data much easier to work with and improves the ease of access. And again, may not be something that you think about if you aren't considering the long-term use of your data collection. You could think about this just in your own personal life. How many times have on your computer you saved something to a location and 3 days later you forgot what you called it, forgot where you saved it. So having these file naming conventions and folder structures already pre-established for your organization can go a long way, in helping others understand how you filed and classified your files, your records. So for best practices, I actually included that in the handout, which I'll talk about later. So metadata is the next portion of this stage, and a lot of you may not be very familiar with metadata and how it works. So all metadata is it's data about data. When I explain this, I think most people can relate to this analogy of using a Microsoft Excel sheet. So if you think about metadata fields as the column headings in an Excel sheet, and then you think about metadata itself as the content that populates those columns, you'll basically have the idea of what metadata is and how it works. So those fields would be those categories, and the what you populate within the body of that Excel would be the actual data itself. So for social scientists, the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, they're a well-accepted standard. They contain a decent amount of important items which you could use for your data collection. For example, creator, again thinking of it in Excel, so creator could be that column heading. Title would be another column heading, description another column heading, and etc. But creator, the title, description, so these metadata tags for Dublin Core, they cover a substantial or a decent amount of what you could potentially be using for your data collection. Here's another one that we could recommend, the DDI. It's suitable for social, behavioral, and economic disciplines, and there are resources on the handout for you to go out and explore more and figure out which works best with your data collection, but just know that there are a handful of metadata standards. So choosing one that best fits for the type of research that you do will go a long way in helping others find your information in the future, right? So if you can find the metadata standards that contain those metadata headings, so those column headings that maybe best suit your collection, then it can make that categorization much easier for you. Citing and documentation would be the next stage. So this one includes citing data and processing it. So properly citing your data is essential for the integrity of your research. So we talked about this with that image that I showed a few slides back about how if you don't properly cite your information, people won't be, or document it even, people won't be able to trace it back to its origin. So they can't validate your work. They couldn't replicate it if they wanted to, because they don't know that what you did is true. So properly citing any data that contributes into the results of your data set is important here. When sharing your data, we recommend that you provide a couple of these answers. So as you're getting ready to put it into a repository, so what information might somebody need in order to use your data set in the future? Also, we talked about how if you're depositing it to a repository, they've got certain standards and formats, but what would that repository require to be able to preserve the data to make it accessible? So again, depending on where the end uses or the end house is for your data set, these are a few things that you're going to want to consider. And then lastly, because some of your data can contain sensitive or personal information like we talked about, you need to keep that in mind as you're adding your collection into a repository. Is how usable is the data if you remove all of that information. So properly citing what you did, documenting what you did, could be very helpful in the circumstance that you do end up removing a lot of this personal information. So the last stage here is storing and preserving. So we talked about how preservation and curation kind of go hand in hand, but we'll talk about storage and backup and standards and formats here. So data may be irreplaceable, especially for the type of data that social scientists collect, where if it's observational, those circumstances may never exist again in the future. So preserving them for long-term use and secondary use is very critical to your work. So we would recommend backups for any data that you collect, possibly in a weekly, monthly time frame as you decide it, in case something happens to that data. Again, the world's not perfect, data does get lost. And the standards formats for the research should be non-proprietary. So as we talked about in the future, how some of that software may not be in existence, there are recommendations for how you can format your information to quote-unquote future-proof it. So giving it the best chance at surviving. And I'm going to show a video of that here right after this on what you can do to give your data the best chance of surviving. But really quick, I just thought this was a great example of that first point here about how data can be irreplaceable. Here we see an ad out for somebody who lost their backpack and they don't even really care about the MacBook that was inside of it. More importantly, they're worried about that 5 years of research data, which was contained on that hard drive within the backpack. So that data could be quite possibly lost forever if that backpack's not recovered. So like I mentioned, here we're going to watch this video on tips on data survival, and this will be the last thing we talk about.
The simple fact is that whereas paper lasts 100 years, sometimes digits don't, and they get jammed up for one reason or another. So that is my first tip for long-term security. My second tip would be to try and lodge your data with the most secure museum or university department or library or whatever that you can find that will take your work. Because again, digital storage, apart from the fact that it becomes increasingly difficult simply because of the sheer bulk that's now available, is also subject to financial controls. And so you will find even university libraries are suddenly under pressure to sort out exactly which material they wish to preserve for the longest time. A third suggestion is to create traffic and volume through running courses or students or advertising your wares to newspapers and journals, so that there is a need for that work to be consulted. And I think that as long as you can help to build up the amount of demand there is to see that work, that really helps its longevity. So they would be my major tips for trying to secure your work.
All right, so just to wrap this up here, quickly review what we talked about, discuss what data curation is, how it relates to social scientists from a qualitative perspective, how your data could potentially be reused in the future, and why it is important to future-proof it. So why this concept of data curation, it should be considered one of your primary foci, along with collecting and analyzing the information. Then we went through the few phases of how somebody in your discipline would partake in data curation. And lastly, I'm going to leave you with this handout. There's a lot of resources on here, probably more than what is necessary, but they fall within the 5 phases that I talked about. And they're a bit redundant, but they're there to help you maybe shore up any information that I didn't talk about, fill in the gaps, and answer any questions that I may not have been able to. All right, so thank you for your time, and goodbye.